So here we are with Clinton Bembry and Dan Elitzer. They are co-creators of Yam Finance, one of the first meme-based yield farming projects in DeFi. I'm super excited to have you guys on. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the Defiant podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Yeah. So this project is really crazy. I think, it was one of the first projects in kind of the second wave of DeFi's yield farming craziness that kind of really pushed the limits. And, people started to question, what is this thing really? Like, are we at the top of the bubble? Like, do these things have any functionality? Like, I think there was like a before and after in DeFi with first like Wi-Fi and then Yam, and then there was this huge explosion. So I obviously will definitely get to talking about all of that. But before we get there, I want to know more about kind of the very early days of Yam, and even before that, just get to know you guys first. What are your backgrounds, and also if you can tell me about the backgrounds of the other co-creators of Yam and how the team came together. Whoever wants to start first.
Sure. So my name is Dan Elitzer. I used to be I was one of the founding team members for IDEO Collab Ventures, which is a venture fund out of IDEO, which is a big design firm, and we invested in crypto and blockchain related companies. I've recently left there and working on a new fund, which we'll be talking more about soon, but just been pretty deep down the DeFi rabbit hole for the past couple of years, and got together with Clinton and then the other kind of co-creators of Yam, Brock Elmore, Trent Elmore, and Will Price. And we had just been kicking around some ideas, and obviously just very deep into DeFi, and were inspired by seeing Ampleforth. And just I personally, at first, I thought it was pretty stupid, and then as I saw it being used more, realized how interesting of a mechanism this actually was with the rebases. And we were all very inspired by Wi-Fi and how that was both distributed and then grew. And was very active in the compound governance process as well. And obviously, I think the whole space has been very inspired by that experiment. And we just kind of were kicking around some ideas and just thought about combining some of these different pieces together, and thought it would be an interesting experiment to try. And it really was an experiment. It was meant to be very short time from concept to launch, and just can't say enough good things about this team. Clinton and I had collaborated on a couple things previously, but I hadn't really worked with the other members of the team before, and it was just really incredible. Even over this short kind of 10-day time that we were working on this, everybody got their hands involved in a lot of different pieces of the concept and how it came together. Clinton was just an absolute wizard doing all the front end stuff, which has then turned into the template that is being used by all of these different yield farms. Yeah. And Brock, obviously just incredible, doing all the substantial smart contract development. And then Trent and Will and I helping a little bit more with strategy and communications and other things.
Okay.
Yeah, you did a pretty good job summarizing all of that. I'm just a little background on myself. I've been building products in the blockchain space for the past 3 years. And so when Dan gave me the call and was like, hey, we got this interesting experiment we're working on in the DeFi space, but we need someone to come in and help out on the branding, look and feel, that sort of thing. I was just like, hell yeah, let's do it. And now we're here, and accidentally created this template for fair launch projects, which was really fun to see.
So who was the one who kind of rounded up this group of people? Were you already talking about this, kinds of projects in a chat group? Just interested to hear more about how kind of the backstory, because it just felt like it came out of nowhere. Nobody knew that there was this team working on anything, and then out of a sudden, there was this like yam emoji everywhere.
Well, to be fair, it did kind of come out of nowhere, seeing as we organized maybe 10 days before launch, I think. So it wasn't, very premeditated, but I'll let Dan kind of.
I mean, I think some of us independently had ideas for some of the kind of core mechanisms in this. And so Will and I were talking about it. And then I think he was talking with Brock. And then we all hopped in a chat together. And of course, Trent joined too. And we were like, oh man, this is great. But like, who's going to do the front ends? Like Trent could kind of do a little bit of some of that stuff. And then I was like, Clinton would love this. And he did. And so he's just an absolute wizard. So, he came and joined us and it just happened really fast. I think the plan wasn't to have an emoji at the beginning. The name kind of initially was just inspired by YFI and Ampleforth. And so put them together like Yample. Yam.
That's why.
That's where it came. And then saw like the yam.finance domain was available. And I think it was like a day or two in that someone was like, hey guys, there's an emoji. Like, oh, whoa. Yeah. Okay. So like that, I mean, obviously that ended up being a very powerful piece of it, but it wasn't like premeditated.
Oh, that's so interesting. So the whole thing roughly took 10 days.
Yeah. From like when we said like, hey, this would be a fun idea. Someone should do this. Why don't we just do this? To when it actually launched was literally 10 days.
That's amazing. Okay. And when you say this is a good idea, what exactly was this? Like, what was the initial idea behind Yam?
I think at the core, it was the idea of having like a rebasing currency that was building a treasury as it grew, if it grew at all, that it would build a treasury to kind of create some kind of floor potentially underneath it. And then to do it fully on-chain governance from day one. And I think that was what was also, I think, really cool about it, was that a lot of other projects launch with meaningful administrative control. And even if you might technically refer to some of these things as non-custodial, like the administrative control effectively makes a lot of them custodial in the early days. And we didn't want to do that. We wanted to see, could it actually be governed in a decentralized manner from launch? And so we never at any time had any administrative privileges over the contracts. The instant the first tokens were minted, already governance control was in the hand of token holders. And so that was a big piece of the experiment too. And then all the other stuff in terms of what it became, like what people want to do with it, like that's all been on the community. And I think we've been pretty surprised at some of the directions that it's been taken.
Yeah, it's definitely been interesting how, started off as one thing, but for a lot of people, Yam is something entirely different. A lot of people see it as just this meme coin. Once you peel back the layers of, the gamification of it and the memes, there's some pretty cool mechanisms underneath that let you do some pretty cool things with it going forward. So it's going to be really exciting to see what the community proposes and kind of how it just evolves going forward from here. Now that we finally are live with the relaunch and it actually works this time.
Right. Okay. So we'll get into all of that. But first, because a large part of this experiment was based on Ampleforth, can you guys get into, what actually a rebasing cryptocurrency is, like how Ampleforth works, and also, what the difference is with Ample? I mean, you mentioned some of these pieces already, how you want it to be, 100% governed by this on-chain mechanism and 100% kind of community owned and controlled. But yet, if you can get into the more specifics on what this actually is, like this rebasing currency, and what the differences are with the previous ones.
Well, so the way to think about rebasing currencies, they're really weird and hard to understand. But I think the best explanation that I've seen for it is where something like Bitcoin has a fixed supply, but a variable price. What rebasing assets attempt to do is to have a fixed price but a varying supply. And so the market cap expands and contracts with the supply, but the price is attempting to find eventual price stability at a target for individual units. And so that's just really weird, and it messes up price charts and other ways that people think about like tracking these things. But it has this really powerful psychological effect that tends to make it be able to drive up and drive down very rapidly. And so one of the ways that Yam is different from Ampleforth is the existence of this treasury. And we just had the first successful rebase with the new launch of Yam about an hour ago. And the rebase ended up contributing $571,000 in YUSD into the treasury. And so that, every time there's a positive rebase, that will grow. And so, that potentially has the effect of creating some kind of baseline in there. Whereas Ampleforth is not trying, there's no treasury and there's no governance, right? Ampleforth is explicitly governance minimized and there's nothing backing it. Here, there is something backing it and extreme governance.
And whether or not Yam is able to find a fixed price is yet to be seen, but that's why it's an experiment. So I guess we'll find out.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And so what's kind of the purpose of having, so I understanding the mechanics, when these rebasing currencies are above their peg, then supply is, I guess, like taken out of the market.
Added to the market above the peg.
Added to the market above the peg to push it down. And then the opposite happens when the currency is below the peg. So, okay, understanding those mechanics, then like what's the purpose of having something like this?
Yeah, I think I think the Ampleforth team has done a good job on some podcasts, and I know Joey Krug and some others have talked about it as well. They're trying to be kind of like useful thing for debt. And I don't fully understand it. It's one of the reasons why I found it interesting was that the first few times I'd seen it, I dismissed it. And I was like, this seems useless, which was the same reaction I had to Bitcoin early on, was that this seems really, really silly. But then the fact that it elicits such strong responses in people, I think is in itself valuable, because it just forces people to reevaluate how they're looking at it and how they're thinking about it. And while my initial conception of Yam was Ampleforth with a kind of treasury to act as like a floor on it, that's not how the community has seen it. They've seen it as more akin to like some kind of DAO that's managing a treasury and happens to use rebasing as a way to bring more funds into the treasury to deploy it in various ways. And so I think, rather than explicitly like selling tokens to people who are interested as a way of kind of pulling in capital to a treasury, it's just automatically pulling in capital as there is more interest in participation in this organization.
Got it. Okay. And what happens when the rebase needs to add tokens to the supply? Is that taken from the treasury as well? Like, where does that come from?
No, it's just automatically expands. Everyone just finds they suddenly have more tokens in their wallet than they did previously. But 10% of that new issuance is essentially issued to the treasury and then used to buy currently YUSD out of the Uniswap pool. And so that pulls it in. So effectively there ends up being actually like 10% that goes into the Uniswap pool as liquidity, plus everybody else who's holding it gets an extra.
Yeah, it might be worth diving into the incentivized pool a little bit more. I found that to be a really interesting mechanism. Dan, you'll do a much better job of explaining it than I will. So I'll let you take that one.
Oh, the reason we have the incentivized pool, I think a lot of these yield farming projects have different incentivized pools, some with reason and some without. We really need an incentivized pool for Yam, or Yam really needs this incentivized pool, because it's to target that price, you need an oracle. And to have it be fully decentralized, like we wanted to use the Uniswap TWAP oracle, time weighted average price. And so we need a pool to pull it from. It needs to be sufficient liquidity to be able to get that. And then we also need a place where, if we're going to be building this treasury, need to know that there's going to be some depth of liquidity there so that those treasury purchases can happen at a reasonable price. And so by incentivizing that liquidity pool, there's the hopefully assurance that there will be sufficient liquidity there to make those purchases. Now, this is one of the many things that token holders can now adjust. And so if token holders say like, hey, we need more liquidity there, they could try increasing incentives. If they think we're over incentivizing, because that's certainly a lot of projects, I think, over incentivize the liquidity that they actually need, then they could lower that. It's all tunable via governance, but I think that pool does serve a very important purpose in the protocol. And Yam itself, I don't really know how it would function in anything resembling its current form if there weren't at least one incentivized pool.
And so right now that YUSD Yam pool on Uniswap is the only incentivized pool that you have?
Correct. There is one other pool that is safe to use and that like it handles the rebases properly, which is the Yam ETH Uniswap pool, but that's not currently incentivized.
Got it. Okay, so let's see if I can kind of summarize Yam accurately. So Yam is a currency that rebases, that expands and contracts its supply to reach its target peg of $1, right?
Currently, technically, it's one YUSD. Which is $1.20, but that could be changed, right? You could change the peg to be like one BTC or like one ETH or whatever you want it to be.
Okay, so this crypto expands and contracts its supply to reach its peg of currently one YUSD. And as a result of these rebases in its supply, the Yam that is purchased to get to that peg goes into a treasury, and that treasury is then managed by the community of Yam token holders. And at the same time, another piece of this is that there's a pool of liquidity on Uniswap, which is used to provide a market to buy Yam in these rebases and to provide a price, a decentralized oracle for the target peg.
Very close. The one adjustment I would make to that is that it's not trying to accrue Yam into the treasury. When the rebases happen and some new Yam is minted for the treasury, that is immediately used to buy YUSD out of the Uniswap pool and pull that into the treasury. So the treasury is trying to hold YUSD, not hold Yam.
Okay, got it. Perfect. And why did you go with YUSD at first?
High yields. It's a very kind of high yield stablecoin. It's the curve, like the Y curve pool, which is a composite of 4 different stablecoins. So it's earning both fees on the trading of those stablecoins. Each of the underlying stablecoins is a composite that's hopefully generating yield, and then it's earning curve rewards on top of it. And so the Wiren Vault that we're using, the YUSD Vault, essentially periodically takes all the curve tokens that are accrued and sells them and reinvests them. So you end up having this currently very high yield thing that's roughly, or it's US dollar denominated at very least. So that's
makes sense.
We thought it made sense. It has created some issues, I think, early on with adoption because there isn't a lot of YUSD circulating. We're in a very high gas price environment. It's come down a lot in the past day. And it's been harder for people to kind of get into YUSD than we had anticipated. But the community is already proposing a number of different tweaks to that, including potentially moving to like USDC or something else for the pool, and then doing the wrapping and converting to YUSD within the treasury itself. the fact that there's now an ETH Yam pool that is safe to use. People can provide liquidity there, so people come in via ETH. There's a number of different factors trying to solve the same thing, which is that as cool as we think YUSD is, it's currently not super easy to use.
Yeah, it's not the most user-friendly. And trying to describe how to get YUSD and the manual process that can go into it kind of highlights that. But I think, and maybe this isn't possible, but I feel like one way the community could change Yam is having it market buy during these rebases from multiple pools, and then the treasury doesn't just have YUSD, it has kind of a basket of assets that it gets.
Yeah. And although on the usability front, shout out to Zapper. They've got a great tool that kind of massively simplifies the process.
Because the process involves going into the Yearn pool to get YUSD and then add liquidity to the YUSD Yam pool, basically.
You need to go into the Y pool on Curve to get Y Curve, and then you deposit Y Curve into the Y vault, and then you get YUSD.
Okay.
And so it's not super straightforward, but then Zapper kind of lets you do that all in one transaction, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can just go straight from ETH or DAI or whatever straight into YUSD, and it like handles all the stuff for you on the back end.
It might cost you $500 in transaction fees, but it's only one transaction. Yeah,
so. That's why you need to do lots to make it count.
Yeah, and that's why increased liquidity can help too. For some people, it's significantly cheaper to like trade like ETH for YUSD or something like that.
Okay. Okay, and then the point, obviously, as you mentioned, is having this really high yielding asset in the Yam treasury, which leads to the question: what is this treasury used for? I mean, my guess is governance will tell. The community will vote on whatever they want to use the treasury for. But what's kind of the early ideas? Like, what do you think would be a good use of these funds?
Well, 1%, the community voted during the kind of interim governance period before the new audited contracts were launched to give 1% of the treasury to Gitcoin grants. And so that's already happened, right? When this first rebase happened, about $5,700 were donated to public goods funding for Gitcoin. Cool. And so every time there's a positive rebase, more funds will go to fund public goods. And so I think that's awesome.
It is.
The funds that are still there, totally up to the community to decide what to do with it. There's already been a lot of interesting proposals in both the Discord and the governance, the longer form governance forum. I think it's gonna be really hard to determine what that's going to be, but hopefully it'll be used for interesting things to either fund external projects, fund things built on top of Yam, fund more audits, fund people to work on it. It's really very open. And so that is what's the experiment about this, right? There isn't some hard path that we're like, this is what the treasury is for. Everyone must use the treasury for this thing. Like Clinton and I and Will and Trent and Brock have no more say in that than anybody else.
Yeah. It's interesting how each of these DAOs, the communities as a whole, have kind of a unique personality, and each one, may decide to do different things. And so far, the Yam community has decided to, help fund public goods, which is cool to see. And going forward, who knows what might come from it.
Yeah, it's been a very pro-social community.
Yeah.
Right?
Good vibes, wholesome. And I think some of that goes back to the branding. Yams, this whole yield farming thing, I feel like it is very almost grassroots vibes to it. But it's been a wholesome community so far, which has been nice to see.
So I'm looking at the price of Yam now, like an hour after the first rebase, and it's at around 6, close to 7. So I guess will the target to 1 happen in a second rebase? Like how will it work?
Every 12 hours, correct me if I'm wrong here, Dan, but every 12 hours it'll rebase. And if the price of Yam is still above 1 YUSD, then it'll issue more yams and theoretically drive the price down. And so, over time, it's expected that it would return to that 1 YUSD peg. And then if it drops below that, then the supply would contract and hopefully drive the price up.
Yeah, the way it's working is it's not trying to issue enough new YAM every rebase to directly drive the price there. It's trying to do it on a more gradual basis. So I think it tries to get like 10% of the way there each time, roughly speaking. But or it says like, let's divide this over 10 periods and move it. And so each time it's just trying to get a little bit closer. And after the first rebase, the scaling factor is roughly 2.5. So if you had 10 yams before the rebase, now you have 25. But then the price reacts to that as well.
It's so crazy to think about kind of having a cryptocurrency that where the price moves to according to a target, but where you actually get more crypto in your wallet when the price drops. Yeah. So I don't know. It
creates an interesting dynamic. Yeah. It's when the price is above $1 and you're getting issued new yams. Me personally, I kind of feel like I want to hold on to it, right? Because I'm getting more and more based on how much I hold. But generally, so far, it seems like the price reacts appropriately to the rebase, and the dollar amount of your holdings theoretically shouldn't change.
What's going to be really interesting is when there's the first negative rebase, right? Because Ample has had negative rebases. So, when if the price goes below the peg and you're like, now suddenly you're going to end up with like less, the price is below the peg and you've got less, like that. I think that can be scary. And that again, can drive things down as rapidly as, the reverse drives things up. And so I think what will be interesting is to see, how does this behave compared to Ample or other things that don't have, a kind of treasury that's also attached to them, and does that affect how long it stays below the peg, and can it help stop some of that downward spiral? I don't know. I think that's part of the experiment to see if that has an impact.
Because I guess like that's the risk that you get to a point where what if people just like start selling and selling. And you can never get to the target again. Like if you're below the peg and you have fewer yams or like fewer or whatever of these rebasing currencies, and everyone starts selling and like panicking. Yeah.
Well, in theory, right? Right now there's $571,000 sitting in the treasury. You wouldn't expect the market cap for YAM to go below 571,000, because at that point, like, why wouldn't all the YAM holders just like use governance and vote themselves like dividend out everything that's in the treasury? And if that's the game theory of like, at this point people would do that, if you think that there's some possibility of a positive rebase, which would then draw more funds into the treasury, it should never trade down quite to that level. It should always go above it. And every time it goes down and then goes back up, so let's say, I'm just completely detached it from the actual numbers, right? Like pretend that all of YAM is at like worth like $100, and then it goes up to, $1,000. In there, that should build up about $90 in the treasury. Because it's kind of moved up, 10% of the gain is gone in. It goes back down. Let's say it bounces off $10, bounces off $100 again, and goes back up to 1,000. Well, now there should, be like, $180 in the treasury. So, it has that interesting effect where like every time it like if it goes back down to the bottom and like reachieves the high, it effectively has doubled the treasury during that time. So that's an interesting thing. And so I'll be curious to see, does the bouncing happen? Also, there may be spending out of the treasury, right? Which may affect that. It's really hard to know. There's like a lot that's interesting to theorize about. And I think what's so cool about what's happening in crypto and DeFi specifically is that we're able to try these experiments and see stuff that like economists have theorized about for many years and just see like, okay, how does it actually work in practice?
Right. Yeah, it's so interesting. And okay, so I want to go back to kind of the very early launch and this kind of community that rallied around Yam. It really felt like this like very like almost zealous group of people who were instant kind of Yam enthusiasts and were, you know, participating in governance and making proposals from like the very early days. Would love your thoughts on, you know, how you lived through that. Like, were you expecting something like that? And why do you think it happened?
Yeah, I would say there was definitely a lot of energy building up within the DeFi space in general. And so, you know, if it wasn't Yam, maybe it was going to be something else. But I think it was just the right timing for something like this to happen. Personally, though, I did not expect this to be as big as it was, especially on day one of launch. I thought it was going to be some fun little experiment that some people played around with and saw, you know, how it worked. But very quickly, I realized as the Twitter follower account was blowing up and people were depositing an insane amount of money into the contracts that this was going to become something much larger than I think anyone on the team had anticipated.
Yeah. I mean, look, we're not dumb. We did think that we wouldn't have spent our time working on something if we didn't think it was interesting. But I think it was at least an order of magnitude, like bigger and more attention than we realistically expected. I think Colin's right that like it was like the Twitter attention to it in just that brief window between when we announced it and when it was live was just like, oh, we may have misestimated how excited people are going to be for this.
Yeah, and I think as we saw the number or the total value locked, I guess, of the funds deposited into the contracts grow, it hit 1 million, and I thought that was pretty big, and then it hit 10 million, and at that point, I was like, okay, I thought maybe that's like was going to be the extent of it, but then fast forward a day, and our peak was somewhere around $750 million worth of crypto deposited into these various farms, in unaudited contracts, which we were very upfront about it being high risk and experimental, but it was pretty insane to see.
It was exciting, but it was also like terrifying.
Oh, yeah.
And I think the one thing that like gave me a little comfort was that most of those funds were just in the synthetics, like forks of the synthetics minter contract, right? So they weren't in any of these pools. We've seen a lot now since Yam, is a lot of these things having these staked liquidity pools where they've got like some newly launched token plus ETH or something in there. And it's like, if the newly launched token goes to zero or like something happens, then like all the ETH or all the other assets paired against it are like going to get drained. And we didn't do that. The only one we had with that was the ETH ample pair. Well, actually, even that was like kind of external to our system, right? So all of these things sitting there, it's like if the synthetics minter contract was broken, there would have been a lot bigger problems in the ecosystem than Yam. So I think, although the headline numbers were really big and really scary, the actual like amount of funds that ultimately got locked in the V1 contracts and stuff were very small. And so I think, hopefully the ecosystem will kind of like learned something from that and like give them a little more caution, but like the past month is kind of indication otherwise.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, for having a significant bug in a smart contract that grew so quickly, things could have been a lot worse than they ended up being.
So what was your like thought process when deciding to just, launch this? without doing any audits or tests. Like, did you guys discuss this? Was this like a thought out decision?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it, but there was no company. We didn't raise any money. We did truly intend it as just like a little experiment, and like we weren't gonna shell out $50,000 or $100,000 out of our own pockets to like audit something. I think in retrospect, like we probably should have told a few people a little bit more about this and like seen if we could have like gotten donated funds or something. Fair Launch Capital, which you're familiar with, and hopefully your readers and viewers are familiar with that too. I think emerged as a response to this and a way to kind of help solve this dilemma for teams that wanted to launch something but didn't have a built-in business model or anything to it, and so therefore no reason to spend a lot of money up front on it. But we talked about it. If we had any idea that it would have gotten as big as it did, like absolutely we would have gone with the audit. But I think it's also a challenge in the industry right now, right? There's not a lot of qualified audit firms. They are massively overbooked and they charge very high rates. And so it just creates this insanely high threshold. And so I don't know what the answer is in terms of going forward. I think, some projects can do things like guarded launches. We considered doing a guarded launch and like putting caps, but realized if we did that, there was the possibility that like a couple whales could come in and just like fill everything up to the caps. And then it's no longer fair.
Right.
It changes the experiment up a bit when you do that. And I'm not going to say that there's nothing I would change if I could go back and change things about the launch, but I do feel like all things considered, it could have been a lot worse. And the story of Yam is very interesting as a result, and the way that the community rallied in those crucial moments to try and save Yam and everything that unfolded there was quite the experience. And so, going forward, maybe it's easier to get audits now for these fair launch projects as a result. And so I'd like to think that some good things came from that.
So can you talk about kind of what you mentioned, what you alluded to right now, the bug and what unfolded after? Like, so I can just imagine kind of launching this project that, hadn't even been on your minds 10 days prior, then suddenly getting up to $750 million in funds in like the different contracts, and then finding a bug. Like, how was that? The
bug was actually very simple. We just forgot to divide a large number by another large number. And as a result, the first rebase, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, but the first rebase minted just an ungodly amount of yams. I think something like 1 trillion cubed of yams to market by what we were using. We were using a different stablecoin for V1, but the excess, that pool allows for up to 10% slippage. And then after that, the excess yams get deposited into our governance contract. And so all of a sudden, trillions of yams are added to the governance contract. And now there's no longer a way to reach quorum for these on-chain proposals. And as a result, governance was more or less black holed. And there was a point in time where, we broke the Etherscan UI. If you multiplied the total supply by the price of Yam, Yam was the most valuable asset on the planet of Earth, which was kind of cool.
Yeah, screenshot that, right? So that was the bug in a nutshell. Was like there was missing division there, and it made it ungovernable. It was a terrible feeling. Like went from this like kind of euphoric but nervous high to being like, oh no, what do we do? And just like kind of going into this mode of just like, okay, what do we do? How do we fix this? Thinking we'd found a solution to fix it, but that it would require massive global coordination to get everyone to buy in and like delegate and do something that actually was not in their short-term economic best interest to do. It was like an actual kind of like real life prisoner's dilemma. And then seeing the community just like rally and make it happen was incredible. And then we just got like the other dagger was like, we passed the threshold and then realized that due to the same issue and like kind of like a second order effect that we hadn't understood, that even though we got into that threshold, it still wasn't going to work to save it. It was crushing. It
was genuinely heartbreaking. And, but, you know, before that, the fact that this community didn't exist 2 days prior and everyone was able to come together and coordinate and get the proposal passed on such short time notice was, you know, at the same time was uplifting. And then even after everything unfolded, the way that the community rallied behind it to make a V2 happen, there was a Gitcoin grant that went up to fund an audit for V2 and V3. And within an hour, we had it fully funded and everyone was rallying behind each other to get this thing underway. And now fast forward a month and some days, and we've just relaunched, or we've replanted Yams. And hopefully this is the final version. But
yeah, and to be clear, like we would have been like, this was an experiment, didn't work. Like the reason why the extra effort went into like doing another audited version and getting it out there was because the community response was so strong. And so as terrible as we felt about like having the bug and having that problem, we felt like the right thing for us to do was to fix that as best we could in as transparent a manner as possible and just get the original intended experiments back on track. And what it becomes from there is completely up to the community. But we really wanted, we thought that if the community was so strong and took such action and they wanted this thing to exist and to work, we kind of owed it to them to get it back on track.
I think that was like so incredible to see. I mean, I remember obviously kind of covering it for the Defiant and writing about it. And it was just like, yeah, this group of people around this token and project that didn't really exist a couple of hours or days before is totally kind of getting behind this project, voting, and then funding this Gitcoin grant. What do you think was motivating that?
I think it was the distribution mechanism, right? We now kind of take for granted that there's all these new projects launching with like all these different farms, but Yam was the first one to do that. And that was not, I think, part of the original thing, but then it became, was like through the interaction of this group that we're like, okay, well, actually just doing what YFI did and just distributing to stablecoin holders just really advantages folks with a lot of like US dollar capital. And we thought this is a crypto project. We should really incentivize the different crypto communities and the stakeholders in those communities who are both from communities like YFI and Ample and Comp that kind of inspired us, but also who, you know, have experience with governance and showed some interest in this, like the synthetics community and the maker community. Like we thought folks would like get governance and would like be interested in this experiment. We wanted to pull them in. And so I think that attempt to knit together these various communities within DeFi and get them involved, I think that was very inspiring. And it was, I think, why people were so excited and wanted to be a part of this.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's very common in crypto for tribalism to run rampant, but I think what Yam did was brought a lot of different communities and ecosystems together, and it was awesome to see. And since then, lots of other projects. You know, we've got I think every single vegetable and food .finance has been taken as a result. But it's a lot of fun too. I think Yam's really tapped into the fun side of DeFi. Yeah,
Clinton's front end. I mean, I've never seen a front end like go so viral. Yeah. It's kind of crazy.
That was totally unexpected. When I was making it, I thought, and if you look at, well, actually, don't look at the commit messages, but everyone's gonna look. But when I was designing it initially, I tried to go for something more serious like Compound, but then it occurred to me as our coin is named after a vegetable, and maybe let's the logos and emoji. Maybe let's lean into this a little bit more and gamify it to some extent, make it fun, make it approachable for more mainstream audiences. But it was really, I didn't expect, I think we have like 250 forks of the repo
really?
now. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Had I known that, maybe I would have put a little bit more time into making it more readable. But actually, I did do that for this relaunch. I made the front end easier to fork and easier to rebrand for whatever food or emoji you would like.
Oh, interesting.
Clinton's eyes were bleeding seeing how some people were using it. He was like, let me make this so it doesn't look so bad elsewhere.
Yeah.
No, but it was really incredible to see just like the same, design everywhere else. And it was just like, clones and clones of Yam. But it's true. It was, I think, because it was just like playful and fun to see and to use. So going forward, are you happy with kind of the Yam version that is out today? Like, was this kind of the initial plan? And if it is, like, are you kind of stepping away and kind of leaving it all to the community, or do you expect to still be involved in the development going forward?
Not much has changed from V1. It really is a relaunch with a few minor tweaks that were voted on during V2 governance. And going forward, I would love to contribute in ways that I can as another community member, but I don't think of myself as like a leader of Yam. I think Yam is very decentralized in spirit. And so I'd like to be, one small piece of that going forward.
Yeah. I mean, I think similarly, to the extent that I can be involved in governance discussions and stuff like that, I'd love to hop in and participate. But it's certainly not my full-time focus. I'm kind of just another community member at this stage. Other members of the team, I think, are figuring out too, like what level of involvement they would like to have going forward. But the intent was not to have a like core team that was continuing development on this. It was to get this thing out in the world and see what would happen. And so, some of them may decide to be involved. Some of them may not. It's all very open.
And so, I mean, we've talked about all the copies of Yam and kind of the explosion in DeFi that's happened since. What are your thoughts on kind of all the food tokens and meme tokens since then? Because it's, I think there's a lot to praise and to criticize. I think, some of the common criticisms is, these things aren't really serving any actual purpose. They're just like made to yield farm, and people are pumping and dumping these tokens, and it's just this like continuous cycle of speculation. At the same time, they are kind of experiments in kind of building community and trying out different kind of governance mechanisms and the different, token mechanisms. So, I mean, what are your thoughts? Is it kind of, do you see it as a net positive, or maybe like what's kind of the end game? Like, where is this going? Because I see it as kind of, we're in this transition to something else. These are a bunch of experiments that will lead to something. So yeah, I guess like that's a big question, but.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I want to preface with saying, I don't know where this is all going to go. And while the food coin mania probably got a bit out of hand, I do think there was a lot of energy there for a reason. And later on, it might take a while, but we'll look back and be able to point out what were the individual characteristics of this recent movement that actually have some value to them. And, whether that's the gamification of finance and making it fun and usable for anyone, or if it's this elastic supply dynamic, it could be any number of the things that are going on, but the space is iterating so quickly that we're collecting a lot of data points. And I think that's generally good. Obviously, there's some scams and some rug pulls and some not so great things that happen along the way. But at the core of it, there's usually something valuable there. And I think we saw that in the previous bull market with ICO mania. And, there was a lot of good things that happened there and a lot of bad things that happened there. And then a few years later, we've iterated on that. And it's, we've kind of kept the good things and left the bad things behind.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, right? There's what I think it's showcasing is the power of some of these incentive mechanisms. And hopefully we can then take these incentive mechanisms and apply them to things that are going to be long-term useful and meaningful. And I don't want to say that there's nothing here that is long-term meaningful and useful. I think some of these things, including Yam, have potential, but it's going to be what people make of them. But now that we've seen in the wild kind of how some of these incentives work and the kind of behavior they can drive, if you're thinking about building something that is really has the potential to be a meaningful open financial primitive, you'd be crazy not to look at some of these incentive mechanisms saying, how can this help me solve some of the early bootstrap problems? How can I actually build this protocol, build sufficient liquidity, and start making things usable? And I think that's a lot of what's been going on in crypto. I mean, I've been focused on crypto since 2013, and I was in microfinance before that. And so I was very interested in how can crypto actually become financial infrastructure for billions of people around the world. And I think the answer is you can't jump straight to there. Even today, 7 years later, you can't jump straight to there. But by using some of these mechanisms and experimenting with these things that feel very game-like or toy-like, we're learning fast, we're iterating fast, and ultimately it's going to help us build something that is much stronger, much more robust, and really can expand out and be globally useful and valuable financial infrastructure.
So for teams building these next generation of DeFi or just even fintech projects and companies, what lessons would you tell them, or what would you tell them from your experience in building Yam?
From my perspective, I would say make it usable, make it fun, make it digestible. And I think certain things like, using emojis as our logo and our icons helped a lot by making it reproducible. And, no one's messaging us, asking us for our SVGs to put our logos places because it's just an emoji. And so I think just reducing friction for people to adopt and use your product or protocol, and then, making it an enjoyable experience. From my perspective, there's a lot of different things to take away from here, but for me, that was the core piece.
Yeah, I think that's one piece. I think a big piece is just test, audit whenever possible. There's no such thing as too much auditing or too much care. But also when you launch something, always have a game plan. I mean, I don't think again, it was a short term. We didn't have a very well thought out scenario plan, but think about what is the upside scenario and how are you going to respond if it just goes gangbusters, and then also think about the downside scenario where if something's wrong or if nobody uses it, what are you going to do in that? How are you going to respond then? I think having gamed out some potential scenarios before launch is a very valuable thing to do. And shout out to friend Derek on the Future Swap team. He was giving a talk to some folks earlier today, emphasizing those. They really learned that lesson too.
Awesome. Okay, and then to wrap up, where do you hope to see Yam 5 years from now, or even a year? I don't know. What's the right timeline for these questions in DeFi? Things change so much.
For me, I mean, this is kind of a joke, kind of serious, but success for Yam is if you start typing in like the emoji search and you type yam and it actually pulls up that emoji rather than needing to type sweet potato, I think that'll be success. But you know, I think, you know, if the community persists and finds ways to create value out of this system and out of whatever treasury it manages to build, you know, if it's still around in 5 years and people are still, you know, even a few people are still talking about YAM and actively involved, I think that would be a huge success. But even just like people learning from it, right, and saying like, this is what we took away from this, and we used it in this way in our own project. You know, I will feel very good about that.
Cool. Clinton?
Yeah, I would like to see more developers get involved, more people jump in, especially on the front end, and really have fun with it and make it into something special. And I'd like to see the YAM community maintain some level of wholesomeness and good vibes, because that's been a big part of it to date. And so keeping that going forward would be awesome to see. And it would just generally be cool to see that this thing still exists a year or 5 years or maybe even 100 years from now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been so interesting. I think it's, you know, just, I'm sure we'll be talking about it because it just like I said, it feels like it came with this new wave in DeFi that marked that before and after. So really awesome to hear the backstory and thinking behind this crazy experiment. So thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.